Now what you hear is not a test. Now what you hear is not a test. Now what you hear.
In the late 1990s, the world of cybersecurity was rapidly evolving as cybersecurity researchers and hackers tried to figure out how they could turn their passions into careers. The world really didn't understand what part security played in their corporate networks. A group known as the Cult of the Dead Cows was on the forefront of this transformation. At DEFCON 5, Sadistic and the Cult of the Dead Cows released Back Orifice. If you have not yet seen the interview that I did with Sadistic in part 1 of this 2-part video series, then I would encourage you to pause this video now and go watch that part first. The original Back Orifice provided a vivid demonstration of what can happen when operating systems don't provide essential security services. But unfortunately, the response to the release of this tool was not to drive the change that we needed, but was instead to make excuses.
They were like, oh, this thing only works on 95, 98, or operate on NT or business workstations. Everyone can relax. And it was just like, what are you doing? The problem here is, the human beings who will run literally anything in software that has the capability of doing literally anything when you run it. There's no safeguards.
This is Chris Rioux, widely known as Dildog, and he is the creator of Back Orifice 2000. Back Orifice 2000 made its debut in 1999 when the Cult of the Dead Cow present at DEFCON.
The man with the plan, the skills, the energy, the badass, Mr. Dildog, and Back Orifice 2000.
If you can believe it, it's possible that even that introduction by the Cult of the Dead Cow at DEFCON undersold Chris, aka Dildog, and his many accomplishments. He was the first employee at Loft Heavy Industries, where he maintained LoftCrack, which is the first publicly known tool to extract and crack LAN Manager and Windows NT hashes. He was a founder at Stake Technologies when they were acquired by Symantec. He was the co-founder of Veracode and was the first developer of that platform. During his career, he's continued to be an active part of the information security community. Even today, Chris and the Cult of the Dead Cow continue to innovate, and they released Valid, designed to combat the rapid collection of private data. You will hear more about Chris and his other projects in upcoming episodes, but first, let's hear about his background and how Chris got involved in the Cult of the Dead Cow.
Dildog, I've been a member of the Cult of the Dead Cow since 1999. I first started interacting with those folks in sort of like 1995, 96 timeframe. I had gone to MIT for college, so I was in the Boston area. I hadn't done a whole lot of like in-person meetups until I got out of Maine, where I grew up. Maine turns out to be a pretty backwoods place to learn system programming, but especially during that time, there wasn't a whole lot of hackers and whatnot, but I did have access to bulletin board systems, and I had heard of Loft Heavy Industries, and I had read Cult of the Dead Cow files on my local bulletin board. So I was aware of these people, but I didn't really think that I would ever meet anybody ever, so that changed for me in around 96 when I went to my first DEFCON, and it was DEFCON 4. And I had been publishing security advisories on BugTrack, which is pretty much the de facto place to do that kind of thing back then. I really just wanted to write video games when I got into computing, so security was sort of an afterthought, and it was just kind of fun, but I had a lot of programming experience making like optimized rendering cores and 3D graphics and things like that. I was working on a lot of video game stuff. So the assembly language that I learned through that for gaming turned out to be extremely useful for like making computers do all kinds of things you didn't expect them to do. Writing buffer overflows. I wrote one of the first buffer overflows for Windows and ended up publishing that as some of my first advisories, and caught the attention of some of the CDC folks in the Boston area through a 2600 meeting that I went to prior to DEFCON. And just so happens that I went to the 2600 in the Prudential Center, some middle of the year 1996, and it just so happened that Mudge and Brian Oblivion and Kingpin and Well Pond and some of the other Loft guys were there, as well as I think Freak Out from CDC and a few other regulars that were going to those 2600 meetings were all there. And it was because of those early 2600s and DEFCON that I actually got to know those folks and started hanging out more on IRC with those people. I hadn't really been plugged into the community until then, but was just doing independent research when they found me. So
Chris, now a CDC member, recognized the need for an advanced version of the original back orifice that supported a wider range of operating systems. The goal was to create a tool that could showcase the vulnerabilities present in the Windows operating system to challenge Microsoft's assurance that only older versions of the tool were at risk.
Back orifice appeared on the Cult of the Dead Cow presentation in '98, and it was around that time that I was made a CDC member, or rather, the people were starting to talk to me and drag me in. And I had expressed interest in writing Back Orifice 2000 because the original Back Orifice, which was amazing and cool, and CDC was getting a lot of recognition for that. It didn't support Windows 2000. Windows NT at the time, when 2000 hadn't actually come out yet. I knew that I could write that. I knew that we could build another sort of more advanced version of Back Orifice, because there was a lot. That was like the number one criticism of BO was, this is only, Microsoft was downplaying it. They were like, this thing only works on 95, 98. It doesn't affect or operate on NT or business workstations. Everyone can relax. And it was just like, what are you doing? The problem here is, the human beings who will run literally anything in software that has the capability of doing literally anything when you run it. There was no safeguards. There was no, permissions or capabilities or anything like that. Software you run, you were just, there was no Windows Defender. There was no reputation stuff. There was nothing. You were on your own. Microsoft's attitude at the time was very much to brush things under the rug unless they absolutely had to deal with them. So, we took the opportunity to make sure that they had to deal with it. In general, it was stuff like that led us down the path of having Windows updates on a regular basis rather than service packs. We were all on a 6-month cadence for updating Windows NT in 2000. Windows update and the ability to respond quickly did not come until the hand was forced.
But Back Orifice 2000 wasn't just a hacking tool. It was an innovation hub. It had an extensible plugin system that allowed users to add commands, encryption, and network transport capabilities. And this leap forward inspired a community of programmers to build their own extensions and plugins for the platform.
The original Back Orifice did give you the ability to run commands, but didn't have a full plugin system for it. The Back Orifice 2000 enabled the injection of plugin modules into the actual executable. I was particularly proud of the fact that BO2K did not use libc at all. It hand rolled all of its functions, so the actual size of the program was tiny. And it did a lot of interesting tricks with the PE executable format that actually allowed it to inject the plugins, which were DLLs, into the executable itself. So it actually remained a statically linked thing as you added the plugins in. So it was like rewriting chunks of the executable so that you could pass around this executable that had things plugged into it and reconfigured. Like the plugins were a DLL, but it also had a configuration blob associated with the DLL that let you change things like what ports it ran on. And you had basically 3 different kinds of plugins you could run. You could have things that would just add commands. You had things that would add encryption or authentication. And then you had network transport plugins. So you could write something that used ICMP for communication instead of TCP or UDP. You could have something that added other encryptions. Like I know people added support for what became AES, and they did like Serpent, and other encryption systems were built on top of BO2K as well. The ability to add multi-user capabilities to it. BO2K only had, the original BO only had like one command and control mechanism. You could add multiple different ways of controlling BO2K. So it had a very rich, extensible plugin system, and there was an SDK like it was like designed to be like, here's the program. If you don't want to know how that works, here's the SDK you can use as a developer to write extensions for Backdoor Office 2000. So it was really aimed at programmers who wanted to make their own BO2K extensions. And, we had written some professional plugins from Loft that kind of were like, here's a registry editor and a file transfer module and other things that you could use that were sort of like flagship plugins for BO2K. And you mentioned Butt Trumpet, and there are other things that people developed over time that would call back over IRC and open up command channels there. And yes, so you got to see people's innovation on top of the platform in ways that you might not have seen in before. BO2K was an opportunity to build a community around developing extensions, and that did happen. We got I still actually talk to a few of the folks who found CDC and found Backdoor 2000 and wrote plugins, and they're all active members of the InfoSec community nowadays. And it was sort of a wild time because you never knew what people were going to do with it. I was always being surprised by what people imagined they could do with Backdoor Office 2000 and what they came up with. The one piece that I was particularly proud of myself was the process hiding capability. We did demo that at at DEFCON when we launched the program. It also had a very primitive but capable ability to look at the remote desktop. It had like an RDP style, like a view around the mouse cursor, so you could like mouse around remotely and see the remote desktop that you were interacting with. That was kind of a new thing that people weren't used to seeing. They saw it with like VNC, but even RDP wasn't that common, or remote desktop was not like a thing a lot of people had access to. I'd say the process hiding honestly was my favorite part. The ability for Backdoor Office to open up another executable like Explorer and copy its own memory into Explorer's process memory, and then run itself as a thread of that other process. So what it looked like to a user was that you'd have the task manager open and you could see the BO2K server running, and then just one day it was gone, but you could still talk to it because it had like migrated and moved into another process. And that's kind of like gave rise to techniques like process hollowing and some of the other, create remote thread based obfuscation and hiding techniques that, various malware tools and things used today. That stuff hadn't really been seen on Windows before. So I was pretty proud of that contribution. Like, by the way, you can use these APIs to do some pretty crazy things, including like making a whole other program run inside the process space of another program. People just hadn't done that before. And, BO2K was basically the first to do that.
And now the stage is set. The original Backdoor Office had captured the world's attention. And now Dildog and the CDC were ready to release this new version that targeted Microsoft's latest operating systems with a whole new suite of capabilities. The only thing the CDC needed was a DEFCON presentation that was worthy of the tool it was featuring, and the CDC did not disappoint. I asked Dildog to tell me what it was like to give that presentation.
It's chaos. It's amazing chaos. We had, a rough idea of what we wanted to do. We wanted to, beat up some computers on stage. We wanted to, focus on BO2K, but also sort of talk about what other things the CDC's been up to. We wanted to inspire. We wanted to do faith healing. We wanted to throw things into the audience. So we all had our contribution. We had ideas that ended up on stage there. I had some people doing music. We had some crazy lights and sound and everything, and that was all like masterminded by people like Chuck Rhodes, who did a great job just making things happen for us. You want 2 gobo lights spinning CDC logos on the side of the stage. This guy was just like, he was the kind of person who could and did produce a 240 volt outlet from two 120 volt outlets by hot wiring the wall of the casino so we could do that. I mean, there were the fact that we didn't burn that place down and cause like a massive fire hazard was, everyone was just going to let us do our thing, and thankfully nobody died. It was a wild and crazy time. We threw accidental malware out into the audience. We had a CD disc full of the backdoor for source code and various things for the press, and it accidentally got infected with the CIH virus when we threw it out there. I mean, basically, some things went wrong with that presentation, but everything that could have gone right did. It had standing room only. There were people outside waiting to get in that never got to see the whole thing. We had a prime time slot, so we got a lot of coverage, and we had the presentation itself, like my slides and whatnot, pretty much nailed down ahead of time. I was still using overhead transparencies, on an overhead projector back then. So we had everything ready to go. It went really clean. We got a lot of press from that. Made a lot of memories. Anyone who was in the first couple of rows of that's never going to forget it. We smashed guitars into computer monitors and threw things, and I don't know, it was a giant bunch of chaos, but it was a lot of fun. And that sort of inspired a lot of people to get involved as well. CDC had a quiet period in the middle, and as we all kind of went and did our businesses and Veracode and whatever else I was up to. And recently we actually launched this thing I wrote called Veiled, with a bunch of CDC people, and we did another big bash at DEFCON recently, this last DEFCON, and tried to evoke some of that cool BO2K launch flavor, and I think we got there. So it's fun. CDC's just we were made to do big, crazy presentations.